Welcome to week number 6. In this video, we will actually come back to something we saw at the very beginning of the course in the Hello World program. And I told you to take that stuff for granted. We didn't really need to bother at that point with what any of that did. And I told you to just take it for granted and we'll come back to it later. And at this point, it's worth asking, so we are dealing with all of these, with all the parameters and arguments that we pass into the functions, methods, and to the program in general. And we have seen that we can hard code some of the arguments into the main function. We can simply default some variables, then we can use global variables and things like that. We also saw that we could obtain arbitrary input from the user from this input function at any point during the runtime of our program. And I'll explain the benefits of that in just a little bit. And finally, in games like Rock, Paper, Scissors, Lizard, Spock, and Guess the Number, we saw that some arguments, for example, those random numbers, could be generated with something what's called the random number generator, or abbreviated RNG. Now we'll go back to the definition of our main function of the program and this weird snippet at the bottom. And again, you will recall that I said this is how I chose to introduce this, and don't worry about what this does. Well, at this point, we should take a look at what this does and why I decided to do this. I will switch over to my lab machine and we will open console_args.py Python file. And I encourage you, as always, to follow along. You can find this file in your downloaded course materials. Here it is. So the comments are, it demonstrates the use of and working with command line arguments. Here are my comments. For now, ignore this sum function. We'll come back to it. So let's dissect what this is and how the main function works and what we are passing into it. Now, as I said, the error code is simply so that you can see immediately whether your program executed successfully with error code 0 when it prints, right? Or if there was some other error code. And here we say that it terminated with this particular error code that we get from the call to the main function. So the error code gets whatever the main function returns. Okay, now how do we call the main function? You see, it is accepting this argv parameter or argument. And we call it with passing this sys.argv, and then it looks like it's a slice. Well, let's first consider the comments of what that is. So the main function is the main function of the script. Arguments. Argv, it is a list. It contains command line arguments passed to the script. Passed to the script from the command line, and we saw already that it returns an error code and the error code of 0 if the execution was successful. So list. Now you should recall everything we studied about lists. And so what is this sys? Now at the very top, remember the imports? So when you import sys, it's kind of, you have to import sys in order to interact with the environment at all. And sys.argv is simply the list that Python gets from the command line. Right? And we saw with lists, this is notation for slicing lists. And this particular notation says that the subslice that we want starts not at the 0th, but at the first element. And then by not including anything after the colon, we're saying we want every single item of the list starting from the first element. And that is what we're passing to the main function. I will explain why we start from the first and not from the 0th after we see our example. Okay, let's jump to the main function and see what it does. So now understand that this argv in the main function is a list containing arguments that we pass via command line. This is a very simple for loop that you should now have no problem understanding. It is a count controlled for loop where I starts at 0, so at the beginning of the list. Because we sliced it from number 1, at this point everything we are actually interested in is already in the list. So we need to start at 0. Then it goes up until but not including the actual length of the list, and it increments by 1. Another way of saying it could be for say item in this list, but I chose to use this notation because I think we haven't seen enough of count control for loops. the very first thing it will do, it will simply print this argument number, right? So as we're looping through this, it will say argument number I plus 1. Why? Because I want us to talk about them as arguments 1, 2, and 3 as opposed to 0, 1, and 2. So that's why I plus 1. So argument number 1, 2, or 3, or 4 or 5 is, and then we actually print the argument. So before we do this, I actually am going to I'm going to comment out this line here, so we don't have to bother with this sum function. And let's see how this works. We will invoke this via console args python, and I will not do anything at this point. So I'll just invoke this as is. Enter. And sure enough, we see no output. And I'll explain why just shortly. But for example, let's do the same thing, and we will pass these parameters. Let's pass high. Then I'm going to input a space. We're going to pass 5, the number 5. I'm going to do another space, and we will pass, let's see, we will pass the string QWERTY, and I'm going to execute it now. Okay, let's see what we have. So we have our argument number 1 is high. Argument number 2 is 5. Argument number 3 is QWERTY. So that's exactly what this does. When we include something other than the name of the Python file itself, and it has to be space separated by this syntax, it treats them as command line arguments passed directly into the program and that are invoked with the script. Now, the difference between asking a user for the input with the input function and doing this, the input function lets us choose when we want to ask the user for input, while this passes all of the parameters at the same time to the program. Now, the benefit of using this is you save a lot of time when you really don't care if the program has these inputs now or at some point later. And if you have, say, 5, 10, or more inputs for some reason, it would be a waste of time for you to prompt the user for each one, even though it really doesn't matter if you can all pass it as a single command line. Now, whenever it does matter when the program asks for inputs, such as an example, the guess the number game, right? It would be silly for you to pass all of your guesses at once because you are expecting some output from the program for it to say higher or lower, right? It would be quite silly for you to say 50 and immediately 25 when the program says higher, and then you pass in 25 again and says, well, still higher, right? So that's the difference. Whenever you don't care if the program has all of your input at the same time, it is actually a lot easier to use the command line arguments than to hard code anything or have the program ask you each time, okay, what's argument number 1? What is argument number 2? And also, as you saw, the program didn't need to know how many arguments we pass, as you will see shortly. It simply looped through all of them, and it didn't need to know, okay, I'm going to ask the user this time for 5 arguments, then for 6 arguments, or something like this. Right? Okay, so what we have seen now is that it simply prints out our arguments. Now I'm going to uncomment this line, and let's take a look at our sum function. It's a very simple function. It sums up a list of integers. So it accepts the list nums, and it is a list of integers to add to the sum. And it at the end returns the sum. The algorithm is very simplistic. You declare and set the sum to 0. Then you loop for every num and in nums, and you add plus equals, you increase the sum by the integer representation of that number. Now, why do we do int and why do we cast this as int even though we will be passing numbers? Well, here is why. Let me undo this and show you an example without it. I'm going to clear this output. And in this case, we do want to be passing integers. So I will be passing integers 1, space 2, space 3. So we want to compute the sum of 1, 2, and 3. And of course, we are expecting 6. And enter. Whoops. You're already familiar with this error. It is trying to add type integer to a string. Now, it is very important to note that everything grabbed from the command line, as you already saw with the input function, is treated as a string and not as integer. That's why we have to cast each of those inputs as an integer. Okay? I'm going to leave this here for reference, and let's try to do the same thing again and enter. So it's telling us that argument number 1 was 1, argument number 2 was 2, and 3 was 3. And now it says the sum of all args is 6, because this call here, it prints out this message, and then it casts it as a string so we can concatenate, but it calls this function sum, and it passes it this entire argv list of integers. And yes, of course, it's obviously worth noting that if we concatenate something that is not a number, we're still going to get an error, because it's going to try to convert a non-base 10 numeric value into an integer. Okay, now one last thing here. I said we'll come back to it. Why do we start at 0 and why do we start at 1 and not at 0? Well, it so happens that if we consider our call to this invocation of this file, in fact, it so happens that everything after the word Python, after the invocation, is an argument. So in fact, the 0th argument in every single case is just the name of the file. That is why we don't really care. We already invoked this file. We don't care to have this value anywhere in the program. That's why here we are slicing from the first element onward. That way we get the 1, the 2, the 3, and so forth. Well, not this, because we know now it breaks the program, but that is how it works. And also remember how I said you do not need to know anywhere in your program how many arguments are actually needed, because guess what? If we do space 5, space 4, space 5, space 6, it will work just fine. It's going to print us all the arguments because we asked for it. Right? But it will compute a proper sum of all of that. So that is actually quite powerful, because you can write very flexible programs that do not need to know, per se, what is going to be passed. They can just account for every possibility. You can do things like loops to say, I don't care how many things you pass me, I can just loop through all of them and compute the sum. This would be a lot trickier with something like the input program, because then the input function, because then the program would need to know how many items it's actually expecting. Otherwise, it would need to get some kind of a stopping condition from the user, and otherwise it would be an infinite loop.